بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا إلى يوم الدين. The moment we've all been waiting for, the chapters of as-salah, of prayer. Today we're going to start with al-awqat, or the prayer timings. طبعا, as we mentioned in the first or the second class, the Muwatta of Imam Malik starts with the chapter of prayer timings, so the ahadith relating to prayer timings, and this is due to the importance of them in the madhab and compared to other conditions of prayer. As we mentioned, al-Akhdari and many others decide to begin with tahara instead, and this is a ijtihad on their part. And we already mentioned in the chapter of tayammum that someone who does not have enough time to make wudu and also pray before the prayer time ends, then he makes tayammum, even if he's capable of making wudu. And this is due to the importance of doing the prayer on time. It's given more importance than making wudu with water. طيب. فصل في الأوقات. الوقت المختار للظهر من زوال الشمس إلى آخر القامة. So the chosen time for dhuhr is from zawal al-shams to akhir al-qamah. First of all, what is a mukhtar time? What is a chosen time? Most prayers have two timings. The first one is a chosen time, and the second one is a necessary time. The chosen time means a time that it is supposed to be given in for someone who does not have an excuse to delay it. The necessary time is the time that you pray in if you have an excuse, such as being afraid of a thief in the mosque, or if you don't have access to water or tayammum during the chosen time, but then in the necessary time you have access to water, so you make wudu. Someone who is asleep, someone who passed out and then came to in during the necessary time. So the person who delays to the necessary time without an excuse is athim, is sinful. The necessary time is only for the people who do not have an excuse. So someone who has a valid excuse, so I think I said that, the opposite. The person who does have a valid excuse, he can delay prayer until the necessary time without incurring sin, as opposed to someone who does not have an excuse. He cannot delay it, and if he does delay it, then he incurs sin for praying it in the necessary time. So the chosen time is always in the beginning of the prayer time, and the necessary time follows. طيب, for dhuhr, what is the chosen time and what is the necessary time? الوقت المختار للظهر من زوال الشمس إلى آخر القامة. So it's from زوال الشمس. زوال الشمس, or the movement of the sun. So the sun reaches noon. It reaches a point where ideally a straight object would have no shadow. It's the solar center of the day. Now, because the modern day our time zones, they're not exactly centered on the sun or the sun's positions. Ideally, every location has its own 12 o'clock, but because that's very hard to do because of using time for work and using time for standardized shifts, we made this thing called time zones, and where we basically take a large amount of land and put them on the same time. We choose one place where it's 12 o'clock, and then we take a lot of land to the east and a lot of land to the west, and we put them on the same time zone. Now, realistically, 12 o'clock noon, is supposed to be the exact point where the sun is in the center of its cycle. It's the center of the day. And how do you know this? It's, depending on where you are in the south or the north, the sun will move in different shapes. So someone who is living in most places that are close to the equator, that are on the equator or close to the equator, most Middle Eastern countries, most of Southern Europe, the sun, we see it coming out of the east and setting in the west. And it's almost this almost perfect arch above us. And the center of that is when the sun is at the highest point. As soon as it starts setting into the west, that's called zawal, the movement of the sun. So as soon as it moves, just the tiniest bit from the center of its cycle, that is zawal al-shams. Now, someone who's living in the very northern parts or very southern parts of the earth, the sun will move in a slight stranger way. Also depends on the season. But you'll see the sun not going above you from one side to the other. Rather, you can see it almost in front of you. And it goes in this tiny loop. This is the horizon. You just see it going up and then going down. So prayer timings in general, regardless of which prayer, regardless of which madhab, there's a lot of calculations that go into it, depending on where you are on the earth. And that's why when you open most of these prayer apps, back in the day, people opened Muslim Pro, but nobody likes them anymore. Now they open Golden Quran or Salat, or there's a bunch of them. If you open the settings and you try to go to the prayer time settings, you'll almost always notice, most people have noticed this, is that there's different calculation methods. You'll find one saying, for example, al-Qura, which is the University of Mecca. Or you'll have one saying Egyptian Religious Authority or something like that. You'll have one saying ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America. You'll find that each of them have their own calculations. If you switch between them, even if your location is the same, like you haven't changed your location on the app. I'm in Amman and I changed the setting. I'm still in Amman, but the prayer times have changed. And this is due to the fact that these different authorities, they use different calculation methods, different solar angles and lunar angles to calculate the prayer times based on where they are in the earth. So that's why sometimes these prayer apps are not always accurate. What's always accurate is using the sun and its shadows. And most of the time, if you're in a Muslim country, the mosques are going to be connected to the religious authority who's going to make sure that the prayer times are calculated correctly, and the adhan of the masjid should always be correct in a Muslim country. The question is the apps that people download on their own. They can mess around in the settings, and sometimes these settings lead to disasters, such as someone breaking his fast 5 minutes before it's actually Maghrib. Or similarly, someone eating 5 minutes after Fajr, because the timing of Maghrib and Fajr, he messed it up on his phone by playing with these different settings. So that's why it's always the safest way is the masajid in your country, or calculating it yourself if you have the energy to do it. Like we said, zawal is when the sun moves from its highest point. As soon as it moves from its highest point and the shadow begins to lengthen, that is when the time of dhuhr enters. So at exactly dhuhr, or right before dhuhr prayer starts, the shadow should be at its shortest period in the day. Sometimes in some places it'll be no shadow at all. Sometimes it'll be a tiny bit of a shadow. So the shadow will be 3 centimeters, 2 centimeters, 1 centimeter. As soon as it goes back to 2 centimeters, that's a zawal. That's when the sun has moved. That's when you know that the prayer time has entered. Like, when does it end? إلى آخر القامة. What is al-qama? Al-qama is length. So to the end of the length. What is he talking about? The end of dhuhr time is when the shadow of an object is equal to its length. Meaning if I get a 1 meter stick and I put it up and I put it in the ground, you know, straight up, you know, it's not angled at one direction or other. It's a straight stick and it's 1 meter long. As soon as its shadow is 1 meter long, it's equal to its length. This is the end of the Mukhtar time of dhuhr. This is the end of the chosen time of dhuhr. And it's also the beginning of the chosen time of asr. Like, as soon as the Mukhtar time ends, the Waqt al-Mukhtar, as soon as the normal time of dhuhr ends, this is when the necessary time of dhuhr begins. So the necessary time of dhuhr begins when the normal time of asr, sorry, yes, the necessary time of dhuhr begins when the normal time of asr begins. And that is when a shadow is equal to the length of the object of that shadow. So as soon as that 1 meter stick has a 1 meter shadow, you incur sin for delaying dhuhr after that, and this is when asr begins. Like, when does the necessary time for dhuhr end? It ends the exact same time when the necessary time for asr ends. Like, والمختار للعصر من القامة إلى الإصفرار. The optional time, I'm going to start annotating just so we can, just so I make sure you guys don't get lost. Like, the optional time for asr begins from al-qama, when the shadow of an object is equal to its length, till al-isfirar, till the yellowness of the sun. What does this mean? During noon, if you look at the sun, it's mostly white. After a certain point, after asr, it gets later, the sun starts to become more and more yellow. And in some places on earth, more and more red or orange. The point is, it's no longer white. Now, most people, as the youth say nowadays, they call this golden hour, when you can see the reflection of the sun is no longer just light. Now it's also golden. You can kind of see a golden color being reflected on the walls and on the ground. This is the end. This is what is called al-isfirar. When you see the yellowness of the sun reflecting everywhere, this is the end of the chosen time of al-asr, and the beginning of the necessary time. Meaning someone who delays asr until after the sun has become yellow and red or red, without a valid excuse, he is incurring sin for delaying it past that point. Like, forgot how to annotate. One second. Accidentally closed it. Now we want to draw or have some form of representation of a dhuhr and asr, so you guys don't get confused. This is a representation of a dhuhr. Here, we have a zawal. Okay, so it's going left to right. So zawal, and as time progresses, we're moving to the right. So, when did we say the optional time for Dhuhr ends? Communicate in the chat so I can make sure you guys are focusing. When does the optional time for Dhuhr end? When shadow is the same length of the object, yes. For the shadow equals the length. It's not before, it's up to and including. So it's not before. So even when the shadow is equal, it includes that point. So when the shadow is equal to the length. طيب. What happens after that? We enter the necessary time. So the necessary time begins at when the shadow is equal to the length, and it ends when does the necessary time of Dhuhr end? When the sun is yellow, correct. Al-Isfirar, sun, sorry, sun is yellow. طيب. Now, Asr. So this is Dhuhr. It begins at Zawal. When the shadow is equal to its length, we enter the necessary time. The end of the necessary time is when the sun becomes yellow. Now for Asr, when does the optional time for Asr begin? Sorry, I made a mistake actually. Um, can't undo. I can. Okay. The necessary time of Dhuhr is not Al-Isfirar. I made a mistake. It's confusing it with Asr. So when does Asr begin? You guys said when chosen time of Dhuhr ends. Yes. So this is the chosen time of Dhuhr ending. This is when Asr begins. So you guys can remember that shadow equals length. It occurs for both lines, this line and the line under it. This is when Asr begins, and this is when necessary of Dhuhr begins. And when does the necessary for both of them end? It is not actually al-Isfirar. Al-Isfirar is when the optional time of Asr ends. So when the sun is yellow, that's when the optional time of Asr ends. However, the necessary time for both of them is until Maghrib. So the necessary time for Dhuhr is longer because it includes Asr. And the necessary time for both of them ends at Maghrib. Any questions about this diagram? I think, I hope that drawing it physically would make it easier, but if anyone still has questions about how this works, now would be the time before we move on to Maghrib and Aisha. Because Maghrib and Aisha work in a very similar way. No questions about? Okay. So, quick review last time. Dhuhr begins at az-zawal. The optional time ends when Asr begins, and the necessary time extends till Maghrib. Asr begins when the shadow is equal to its length. The optional time ends when the sun is yellow, and the necessary time is until Maghrib. Like someone asked, if someone delays Dhuhr due to a valid reason, can he pray it till sun is yellow? So if someone delays Dhuhr past the optional time for a valid reason, he has until Maghrib. This is the necessary time. And the earlier, the better. But he has until Maghrib if he has a valid excuse. طيب. Now let's start with المغرب. والمختار للمغرب قدر ما تصلي فيه بعد شروطها. The optional time for al-Maghrib. The optional time of al-Maghrib ends when the sun has completely set, meaning when the disk of the sun has completely gone below the horizon. It ends in the amount of time that it takes to pray and fulfill the conditions of prayer. So the sun has just set. There's a specific amount of time. You need to do adhan, do iqama, cover your awrah, do wudu, and pray. This is the optional time for al-Maghrib. And what is understood without this complication, what is understood is that as soon as the Maghrib adhan goes off, then you have to pray immediately. That's the optional time. Any delay in Maghrib is sinful. Any delay for no valid reason is sinful. Now this is if you fulfill your wudu and you cover your awrah and you go to the mosque and the jama'ah waits 2-3 minutes for the imam to come, then that's not sinful on you or anyone. So this is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the entire jama'ah or praying alone, waiting for no valid reason. But if you go to the mosque and your conditions are met, but they wait 2-3 minutes, then it's not asked of you that you immediately pray Maghrib. You wait for the jama'ah. If the jama'ah is waiting till the end of the prayer time, then no, then you pray on your own. But the end of the optional time is when the time equal to fulfilling conditions of prayer and praying. That's the optional time for al-Maghrib. And the necessary time is until when? Without reading, guys. Think about this as Dhuhr and till what it extended to. Try to use the same logic we used in Dhuhr. When does the necessary time of Maghrib end? Like, because we're running a little short on time, I'm going to jump in and say it myself. It ends at Fajr. The necessary time for al-Maghrib and for Isha is until Fajr. And what is Fajr defined as? We'll get to that when we get to Fajr. Isha. When does Isha begin? Isha begins after Maghrib al-Shafaq. The setting of al-Shafaq. What is al-Shafaq? The sun sets. So we said Maghrib begins when the disk of the sun sets. Isha is when the light of the sun sets. So after the sun sets, there's usually redness in the sky. If you ever watch the sunset, you realize even after the sun sets, you can still see, this halo of light around where it has just set. This light, this red light, as soon as it disappears and the sky becomes black, this is when Isha enters. Maghrib al-Shafaq. مغيب الشفق. والمختار للعشاء من مغيب الشفق إلى ثلث الليل الأول. So, uh, uh, I'll just say blackness of the sky because I don't know the literal translation of مغيب الشفق. إلى ثلث الليل الأول. 1/3 of the night. After the first third of the night, that is when the optional time for Isha ends. Now, what is 1/3 of the night? The night begins at Maghrib and it ends at Fajr. So, from Maghrib to Fajr, so this diagram is not exactly to scale. However, what you guys understand from the phrase 1/3 of the night. So this is the night. This is the Shar'i definition of night. From sunset to Fajr, 1/3 is somewhere here. Again, this diagram is not to scale, but 1/3 of the night is where the optional time for Isha ends and the necessary time begins, and similarly to Maghrib, it extends until Fajr. So for someone who does not have an excuse to delay Maghrib, for him to not incur sin, he has to pray it in the time that it takes to fulfill the conditions of Maghrib and pray Maghrib. For someone who has no valid excuse to delay Isha, he has to pray it in the optional time, which is from Maghrib al-Shafaq, the blackness of the sky, until 1/3 of the night. After that, he is sinful for having no valid excuse. طيب. We have 10 minutes. Let's try to do Fajr. I assume that we wouldn't be able to finish this in one day, and it seems I was correct. Fajr. Fajr is simpler because Dhuhr and Asr, as we saw, are connected. Their timings are connected. Maghrib and Isha, as we saw, their timings are connected. Fajr is independent. And technically, the correct term is Salat al-Subh, not Salat al-Fajr. Using the correct terminology in the madhab, Fajr is the sunnah of Subh. Subh is the mandatory prayer. طيب. والمختار للصبح من الفجر إلى الإسفار الأعلى وضروريه إلى طلوع الشمس. So, Fajr, Isha is when the light of the sun sets. Subh or Fajr is when the light of the sun appears. Not the sun itself. That's the end of Fajr timing. Not when the disk of the sun appears, when the light of the sun appears. Now, there's two Fajrs. There's al-Fajr al-Kadhib. There's the lying Fajr, which happens earlier. This is not when Fajr begins. So earlier on, if you look at the horizon, if in a place where with no light pollution, which is hard to do nowadays, but if you ever had the chance to watch the sunrise, at first, if you look at the horizon, there is a horizontal, almost technically not horizontal, but yes, there's a vertical shape of light. So if you look at the horizon, there's a vertical shape of light that goes from one end of the sky to it goes upwards. This is the lying Fajr. This is not the real Fajr. So this tiny shaft of light that goes vertical will disappear. After it disappears, there is a general appearance of light in the sky, and that is the real Fajr. That's when the optional time of al-Fajr begins. So the real Fajr, the real appearance of the light, it's a general appearance of light over the entire horizon, not a specific place. And the optional time ends with al-Isfar al-A'la. Al-Isfar al-A'la is when you can actually see light in, in front of you. First of all, when the stars no longer appear. After a certain point, there's so much light from the sun that you can no longer see the stars. And also, you can start to see people's faces. This is when the optional time begins, because this is very close to شروق الشمس, to the sunrise. الإمام مالك narrates in his Muwatta عن يحيى بن سعيد عن عمرة بنت عبد الرحمن عن عائشة زوج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أن رسول الله إن كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يصلي الصبح فينصرف النساء متلفعات ببروطهن ما يعرفن من الغلس. Aisha رضي الله عنها says the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم used to pray Fajr and then finish, and the women would go back to their homes. متلفعات, they would be, they would have their covers on, and they would not be known, not because they were wearing niqab, but rather because of how dark it was. What does this mean? This is showing you how early the Prophet ﷺ prayed Fajr. That by the time he finished, so this is, sorry, when light is clearly seen, and Sirat al-A'la, the Prophet ﷺ prayed so early, and we know that the Prophet ﷺ didn't, pray fast. He would take his time, he would read long surah. So this shows you how early the Prophet ﷺ prayed, that by the time he's finished, the woman would go back to their homes. Because of how dark it was, nobody could see their faces. You could look at a woman and not know who she is. Not because she's not wearing a niqab, but rather because there's no light in the sky yet. It's still basically night. That's how early the Prophet ﷺ prayed Fajr. It's clearly seen. I shouldn't talk while I type because I type wrong words. When light is clearly seen. Like, when does the necessary time begin? And from here, and the necessary time ends when the disk of the sun rises. That is Salat al-Subh. So the real Fajr, when the light is seen generally in the horizon, up until when light is seen on objects, you can actually see objects and recognize objects. And then when the disk of the sun rises, that is the end of the necessary time. Of course, that hadith I just mentioned, one of the most highly debated hadith, not only in the madhab, but across all madhab. But that's a story for another time. Is there any questions about any specific prayer time or the prayer times in general? Hold on, it's recommended, it's mustahab, absolutely, in every case, to pray as early as possible, except for dhuhr. You delay just a tiny bit so that the heat of the sun does not, annoy people. So they wait a bit for the shadows to settle in, and then that's the recommended time for dhuhr. But for every other prayer, it is the beginning of the time. When does the necessary time of subh end? Sunrise. When the disk of the sun rises. That's when the necessary time of subh ends. Sheikh here, Fajr refers to the Fard Salah. Actually, the subh and Fajr are different in Maliki Fiqh. So, Fajr, in terms of the movement of the sun, is when the light appears. In terms of the names of the Salah refers to the Nafilah, the Sunnah you pray before the Subh prayer, but the actual Fard prayer is called the Subh. Now, all of this is happening in the time of the day called Fajr. This entire time of the day is called Fajr. The Salah, the Fard Salah is called al-Subh. The Sunnah Salah is called al-Fajr. Was anybody lost in the middle of the class but eventually found their way? Because I know I misspoke multiple times. Because when you're saying so many names and timings, it's hard not to mix up at least once. Last chance for questions. As always, if you want to turn on your microphone, you're allowed to say anything. What if the time of the Subh Salah in Masjid is late in the necessary time and he has no other options but to pray there? This is usually done in Hanafi countries because according to the Hanafi madhab, it's mustahab to delay Fajr or Subh, whatever they call it. If it's delayed past the end of the optional time, then you pray on your own. However, if they're praying in the end of the optional time, if they're praying in this area, then it's denied. You can wait for them, you can pray with them. However, if they begin to pray during this time, then try to find the jama'ah that can pray on their own. But your question is based on a debate regarding a foundational topic, which I just realized there's less than 1 minute before the Zoom ends. So we can go into this deeper, the issue of the Hanafi mosques. We can go deeper into this issue next time. Inshallah, I'll begin by talking about it. So yeah.